4 minutes. That's all it took. 4 minutes for a single gunner to rewrite the rulebook of aerial combat, to turn accepted wisdom into dust, and to prove that sometimes survival depends on doing the one thing everyone says will get you killed. When Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner opened fire that morning over the North Sea, he wasn't following doctrine. He wasn't obeying orders. He was doing something the training manuals explicitly forbade, something his commanding officers had warned would be suicide. And in those 4 minutes, he shot down 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s, saved his entire bomber formation, and forced both sides of the war to completely rethink how aircraft defended themselves in combat. But the cost of that victory, the psychological weight of what he did and what it meant, would follow him for the rest of his life. This is the story of how one man's refusal to die according to the rules changed warfare itself. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss our next story. The morning of March 18, 1944 began like dozens of mornings before it. Cold, gray. The kind of European spring dawn that feels more like winter refusing to surrender than any genuine promise of warmth. At RAF Ridgewell in Essex, England, ground crews had been working through the night preparing 18 Boeing B-16 flying fortresses for a deep penetration raid into Germany. The target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, industrial facilities that fed the German war machine, its ability to build tanks, aircraft, and weapons. American strategic bombing doctrine held that if you could destroy these choke points, these critical nodes in the enemy's production capacity, you could cripple their ability to wage war without ever setting foot on German soil. It was a clean theory, clinical. The reality, as the men of the 381st Bombardment Group knew all too well, was something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner was 23 years old that morning. He'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a machinist who'd worked the steel mills until the Depression shut them down. Ben had joined the Army Air Forces in early 1942, not out of patriotic fervor or hatred of fascism, but because it seemed like steady work, and because his girlfriend had told him she'd only marry a man in uniform. He'd washed out of pilot training after 16 hours of flight time. Depth perception issues, the evaluator said. Not severe enough to disqualify him from service, but enough to keep him out of the left seat. So they made him a gunner instead, ball turret gunner specifically. The most exposed, most vulnerable, most psychologically demanding position on a B-17. The ball turret was a Sperry rotating sphere that hung from the belly of the aircraft like a glass and metal egg. Inside, a gunner sat in a fetal position, knees drawn up, surrounded by two 50 caliber machine guns and a curved sheet of plexiglass that offered a panoramic view of the sky below. No parachute, no room for one. If the aircraft went down, if the landing gear failed, if the turret's rotation mechanism jammed, the ball turret gunner died. Simple as that. Everyone knew it. The statistics were available to anyone who cared to look. Ball turret gunners had the highest casualty rate of any position on a heavy bomber. They died from fighter attacks, from flak fragments that shredded the turret, from mechanical failures that trapped them during crash landings. They died in ways that gave their crewmates nightmares. Ben Warner had completed 19 missions by March 18, 1944. 6 more and he'd finish his tour, go home, marry that girlfriend, and spend the rest of his life trying to forget what it felt like to dangle in a metal sphere at 25,000 feet while German fighters tried to kill him. He'd seen men die. He'd seen a B-17 from his own squadron take a direct flak hit that turned the aircraft into a fireball so bright it hurt to look at. 10 men gone in an instant. No parachutes, no time. He'd seen fighters chew through bomber formations, leaving trails of smoke and falling debris that had once been someone's friend, someone's brother, someone's son. And he'd learned the rules of aerial combat the way every gunner learned them. Track your target, lead your shots, fire in short, controlled bursts to avoid overheating your guns. And above all else, never, under any circumstances, hold down the trigger and spray ammunition in a continuous stream. That was the cardinal rule. Burst fire only. Because if you burned through your ammunition too quickly, you'd be defenseless when the next wave of fighters came. The briefing that morning had been routine. The intelligence officer pointed at maps, traced routes, estimated fighter opposition as moderate to heavy. The weather officer predicted clear skies over the target, which meant good bombing conditions but also perfect visibility for German interceptors. The group commander reminded them that this was their job, that every factory they destroyed brought the war closer to its end, that their sacrifice mattered. Standard speech, standard mission. 18 bombers would take off, join a larger formation of over 200 B-17s and B-24s, fly into Germany, drop their bombs, and come home. Some of them wouldn't make it back. Everyone understood that. You didn't talk about it, but you understood it. Ben's aircraft that day was designated as Liberty Bell, a B-17G that had already survived 32 missions. 32 times she'd flown into German airspace and come back. The ground crew treated her like a lucky charm, and maybe she was. Her pilot was First Lieutenant James Keller, a farm kid from Iowa who flew with the kind of steady competence that kept crews alive. The co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, waist gunners, tail gunner, and Ben in the ball turret. 10 men, sharing the same fate, breathing the same recycled oxygen, trusting each other with their lives. They took off at 0600 hours, the sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines turning over, the smell of aviation fuel and oil, the sensation of the aircraft lifting free from the runway. It never stopped being surreal. A machine weighing 30 tons somehow defying gravity, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness while inside, 10 men settled into their positions and tried not to think about what was coming. Ben waited until they reached altitude before entering the ball turret. Standard procedure. No point sitting in that cramped sphere any longer than necessary. At 10,000 feet, he squeezed through the hatch, contorted his body into the position, and pulled the hatch closed above him. The electric motor hummed as the turret rotated into position. And then there was nothing but sky. Sky and the other B-17s forming up around them. Dozens of aircraft moving into combat box formation designed to maximize their defensive firepower. The flight across the English Channel was quiet, too quiet. Ben watched the gray water below, the occasional white cap visible through breaks in the clouds. He thought about home, about his father working those mills, coming home with hands permanently stained black from coal dust and grease, about his mother who never complained, who made dinners stretch across 3 days, who smiled even when there was nothing to smile about Sarah, his girlfriend, who wrote him letters every week that arrived in bundles of 5 or 6 at a time. She told him about her job at the munitions plant, about her sister's wedding, about the neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking. Normal things, a normal life waiting for him if he could just survive 6 more missions. They crossed into German airspace at 0900 hours. The flak started almost immediately, black puffs of smoke appearing in the sky, like dark flowers blooming and dying in seconds. The aircraft shuddered when the concussions hit, fragments of shrapnel pinging off the aluminum skin. Ben rotated the turret, scanning for fighters. Nothing yet, but they'd come. They always came. The doctrine for defending a bomber formation was well established by March 1944. The B-17s flew in tight formations, each aircraft positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. If fighters attacked from any angle, they'd face guns from multiple bombers simultaneously. The theory was sound. In practice, it meant that when fighters did attack, they came fast and they came from directions calculated to minimize their exposure. Head-on attacks were favored, fighters diving down through the formation from 12 o'clock high. Their combined closing speed with the bombers, exceeding 500 miles per hour, giving gunners only seconds to track and fire before the enemy flashed past. The German pilots knew what they were doing. They'd been doing it for years. The first wave hit at 0930. Ben saw them before anyone else called them out. Small dots approaching from 11 o'clock, sunlight glinting off canopies. He counted them. 15, maybe 20. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the Luftwaffe's primary single-engine fighter. Fast, maneuverable, armed with 20-millimeter cannons and machine guns that could tear a bomber apart if given the chance. He keyed his intercom, called out the position, heard other gunners confirming sightings from other angles. And then the fighters were on them. The sound of defensive fire was overwhelming. Every gunner in the formation opening up simultaneously, 50 caliber rounds streaming out in tracers that looked like red lines drawn across the sky. Ben tracked a 109, led the target, squeezed his triggers in a 2-second burst. The guns hammered in his hands. Shell casings ejected into the turret, bouncing off the plexiglass. He couldn't tell if he'd hit anything. The fighter rolled away, disappeared beneath the formation. Another one came from a different angle. Ben rotated the turret, fired again. Short bursts, controlled. By the book. The first B-17 went down at 0934. Ben saw it happen, saw the fighter's cannon rounds walk up the bomber's fuselage, saw the right wing fold upward and snap off, saw the aircraft roll inverted and begin its death spiral toward the earth 5 miles below. He counted 3 parachutes, 3 out of 10. The rest were already dead or trapped inside a falling coffin. The formation tightened up, closed the gap where that bomber had been. Kept flying. That was the only option. Keep flying. The second wave came 10 minutes later. More 109s attacking from different angles, probing for weaknesses in the formation's defensive fire. Ben's guns were getting hot. He could feel the heat radiating through the turret. He checked his ammunition counter. Halfway through his supply, he'd been firing carefully, but even careful shooting depleted ammunition quickly when the attacks kept coming. A fighter flashed past so close he could see the pilot's face, see the black crosses on the wings. He fired. Missed. The fighter was already gone, rolling away to set up another attack run. This was how bomber crews died. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but through attrition. Wave after wave of attacks, each one taking down 1 or 2 bombers until the formation was shredded and the survivors were scattered and vulnerable. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They were patient, methodical. They didn't need to destroy every bomber in one pass. They just needed to keep attacking until the defensive fire slackened, until gunners ran out of ammunition, until damaged aircraft fell out of formation and became easy prey. At 0955, something changed. Ben saw it developing before it happened. A large formation of fighters, more than he'd seen in one group before, assembling at 2 o'clock high. Not 15 or 20 this time. 30, maybe more. They were organizing for a mass attack, a concentrated assault designed to overwhelm the formation's defenses through sheer numbers. If they all came in at once, from the same angle, the gunners couldn't possibly engage them all. Some would get through, and once they got through, the killing would start in earnest. Ben keyed his intercom, reported what he was seeing, heard the tension in the pilot's acknowledgement. The entire crew knew what was coming. 30 fighters attacking simultaneously wasn't something you survived through skill or luck. It was mathematics, probability. Some of those fighters would score hits. Some of those hits would be fatal. The only question was which aircraft would go down. The fighters began their attack run. Ben watched them come, a swarm of Bf-109s diving toward the formation in a loose line abreast formation. Beautiful in a terrible way. Precise. Professional. These weren't green pilots. These were veterans who'd been killing American bombers for months, who knew every trick, every defensive pattern, every weakness. They came fast, using the sun at their backs to make themselves harder to spot, harder to track. Ben rotated his turret, selected a target, prepared to fire, and then something happened that nobody could have predicted. One of the lead fighters, maybe 50 yards ahead of the others, took a burst of defensive fire from somewhere in the formation. Not a fatal hit, but enough to damage something critical. The fighter's engine began trailing smoke. The pilot tried to pull up to abort his attack run and break away from the formation. But at that speed, at that angle, pulling up meant climbing directly into the path of the fighters behind him. The result was inevitable. The damaged 109 collided with the fighter immediately behind it. A mid-air collision at 400 miles per hour. Both aircraft disintegrated instantly. Metal and debris and human bodies transformed into an expanding cloud of wreckage that the following fighters flew directly into. Ben watched, frozen, as the entire attack formation dissolved into chaos. Fighters braking left and right to avoid the debris field. Their careful coordination shattered. Some pulled up too hard and stalled. Others collided with each other trying to evade. In the span of maybe 3 seconds, an organized attack turned into a confused melee, with fighters scattered across a half-mile of sky, all of them vulnerable. none of them in position to threaten the bomber formation. And in that moment, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He saw what the training manuals never accounted for. He saw an opportunity that doctrine said didn't exist. The fighters were disorganized, focused on avoiding collisions rather than attacking bombers. They were exposed, vulnerable. For maybe 30 seconds, perhaps a full minute, if he was lucky, those fighters wouldn't be thinking about offense. They'd be thinking about survival. And in that window, a ball turret gunner who was willing to abandon everything he'd been taught about ammunition conservation could inflict casualties that would break the attack entirely. Ben rotated his turret to cover the widest possible field of fire. He selected the nearest fighter, a 109 pulling up hard to avoid debris. And then he did what every instructor had told him would be suicide. He held down both triggers and didn't let go. The guns roared. Not short, controlled bursts. Continuous fire. Both 50 calibers spitting rounds at a combined rate of over 800 rounds per minute. The recoil vibrated through the entire turret. Shell casings poured out, filling the cramped space, hot brass bouncing off Ben's legs, his arms, his face. The tracers formed a solid stream, a river of light that he walked across the sky like a man spraying water from a hose. And fighters started falling. The first 109 took the stream of fire directly through its engine cowling. The engine exploded, pieces of the aircraft scattering. The pilot never got out. The second fighter, turning hard to the right, flew directly into Ben's line of fire. Rounds chewed through the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled inverted and began its descent. Still, Ben held the triggers down. His ammunition counter was spinning backward, rounds depleting at an insane rate. But the fighters were still there, and he was still hitting them. A third 109, this one trying to dive away from the chaos, took rounds through its left wing. The wing structure failed. The aircraft tumbled. A fourth fighter, turning back toward the formation as if to continue the attack, flew into the stream. Rounds hit the fuel tank. The fighter turned into a fireball that left a trail of burning aviation fuel across the sky. Ben kept firing. His guns were screaming now, the barrels overheating, but they hadn't jammed yet and he couldn't stop. Not while there were still targets. The other gunners in the formation saw what was happening. Saw one ball turret gunner engaging multiple targets simultaneously with continuous fire. Some of them thought he'd lost his mind. Others understood immediately what he was doing. And a few of them, the ones who'd been in combat long enough to recognize a tactical opportunity when they saw it, followed his lead. More streams of continuous fire reached out from the formation. Not everyone. Most gunners stuck to doctrine, fired in bursts, conserved ammunition. But enough broke the rules that the effect was devastating. In the chaos of the aborted attack, with fighters scattered and disorganized, sustained fire was catastrophic. The Bf-109s had nowhere to go. Breaking left meant flying into fire from the port side gunners. Breaking right exposed them to starboard guns. Climbing put them in front of the top turret gunners. Diving brought them into range of the ball turret gunners, who, like Ben, had decided that survival mattered more than following the manual. The fighters started going down faster than anyone could count. Ben's ammunition ran out at 09:58. 4 minutes. That's how long he'd held those triggers down. 4 minutes of continuous fire that consumed every round in his ball turret's ammunition supply. The guns fell silent. The sudden absence of recoil was disorienting. His ears were ringing despite his headset. His hands were shaking from the vibration. The turret was filled with hot shell casings up to his knees, and outside the sky was full of falling aircraft. He counted them while his hands shook and his heart hammered. Pieces of fighters spiraling down, trailing smoke and fire. Parachutes opening, white canopies against the gray German countryside. Some parachutes didn't open. Some pilots never made it out of their aircraft. Ben counted 12 fighters down, 12 Bf-109s that he'd personally engaged. Not all of them were his kills alone. Other gunners had hit some of the same targets, but he'd damaged or destroyed 12 enemy aircraft in 4 minutes of sustained fire. 12. The remaining German fighters broke off the attack. They'd lost too many aircraft too quickly. The attack that was supposed to overwhelm the bomber formation's defenses had instead turned into a slaughter of their own fighters. They scattered, diving away, heading back to their bases or looking for isolated damaged bombers they could pick off without facing concentrated defensive fire. The immediate threat was over. Ben sat in his turret, surrounded by empty shell casings, staring at the sky. His ammunition was gone. He was defenseless now. If another fighter attacked, if a second wave came, he'd be useless. He'd violated the cardinal rule of ammunition discipline, and now he had nothing left. But the attack was over, and he was still alive, and his bomber was still flying. He keyed his intercom, reported his ammunition status. Lieutenant Keller's response was 2 words. "Good shooting." That was all. Good shooting. As if what Ben had just done was normal. As if it hadn't been a desperate, probably insane gamble that could easily have left him defenseless during a follow-up attack. The formation continued toward Schweinfurt. They'd lost 3 bombers so far, 30 men dead or captured, but the formation was still intact, still capable of completing the mission. They reached the target at 10:30 hours. The bombardier took over, adjusted his Norden bomb sight, and when the lead aircraft dropped its bombs, the entire formation followed suit. Hundreds of 500-pound bombs fell toward the factory complex below. Ben watched them fall, watched the explosions blossom across the target area. Fires started. Buildings collapsed. Somewhere down there, German workers were dying, crushed under rubble or burned alive. The clean theory of strategic bombing, the messy reality of high explosives detonating in populated areas. The formation turned for home. The return flight was quieter. A few scattered attacks by individual fighters, but nothing like the mass assault Ben had broken up. The Luftwaffe pilots seemed cautious now, uncertain, unwilling to press attacks against a formation that had demonstrated such devastating defensive fire. The B-17s crossed back into Allied airspace at 1300 hours. By 1400, they were over England. By 1500, they were landing back at Ridgewell. Ben climbed out of the ball turret after the aircraft had fully stopped, after the engines had shut down. His legs barely supported him. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and a trembling in his hands that wouldn't stop. The ground crew came to inspect the turret, found it filled with shell casings, found the gun barrels discolored from heat stress. They asked him what happened. He told them, held the triggers down for 4 minutes straight, burned through his entire ammunition supply in one continuous burst. The crew chief looked at him like he'd admitted to a war crime. The debriefing was extensive. Intelligence officers wanted details. How many fighters? What angle of attack? Who fired first? How many confirmed kills? Ben tried to answer, but the questions felt surreal. He'd been in that turret watching fighters explode and fall, and now he was sitting in a room drinking bad coffee and trying to put numbers to what he'd seen. 12 fighters engaged. He was certain of that. How many were confirmed kills versus damaged aircraft? He didn't know. Couldn't know. When you're firing into a melee of fighters at 400 miles per hour, you don't get to watch each target until it hits the ground. You move on to the next threat. The intelligence officers seemed frustrated by the lack of precision. They needed exact numbers for their reports. Confirmed kills counted toward the crew's score, toward decorations and recognition. But Ben couldn't give them certainty. Just what he'd seen. 12 fighters engaged, multiple fighters down. Beyond that, he was guessing. The officer made notes, said they'd correlate his report with those from other crews, try to piece together what happened. What happened was discussed extensively over the next several days. News spread through the bomber groups at Ridgewell and other bases. A ball turret gunner had held down his triggers for 4 minutes, violated ammunition discipline doctrine, and shredded an entire fighter formation. Some crews heard the story and thought it was exaggerated. Nobody fires continuously for 4 minutes. The guns would jam, they'd overheat. It was suicide. Others heard the story and started asking questions. If it worked once, would it work again? Should gunners be trained to use sustained fire in specific tactical situations? Was the doctrine of burst fire actually wrong? The Army Air Force's response was complicated. On one hand, Ben had achieved remarkable results. The attack he'd broken up could have resulted in devastating losses to the formation. His actions, reckless or not, had probably saved multiple bombers and crews. On the other hand, He'd violated established doctrine in a way that could have left him defenseless during a follow-up attack. If the German fighters had regrouped and come back, Ben would have been unable to defend his aircraft. The fact that they hadn't regrouped didn't make his decision strategically sound. It made him lucky. The official commendation came through 10 days later. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial combat. The citation mentioned his aggressive defensive fire and multiple confirmed kills, but it didn't mention the sustained fire technique. That detail was quietly noted in after-action reports and tactical assessments that circulated among training commands and operational units. The question of whether to modify defensive fire doctrine was debated at levels far above Ben's pay grade. What actually changed was more subtle than a formal doctrine revision. Gunners started being briefed on tactical situations where sustained fire might be appropriate. If enemy fighters were disorganized, if they were vulnerable due to mechanical failures or mid-air collisions, if the tactical situation presented a brief window of opportunity, then aggressive, sustained fire could be effective. But only in those specific circumstances. The default doctrine remained burst fire and ammunition conservation. What Ben had done was reclassified as a valid tactic under specific conditions rather than a general approach to aerial combat. The psychological impact on Ben himself was harder to quantify. He'd killed at least a dozen men in 4 minutes. He'd watched them fall, watched their aircraft disintegrate, watched parachutes open and sometimes fail to open. Those pilots had families, parents, maybe wives and children. They joined the Luftwaffe for the same complex mix of reasons Ben had joined the Army Air Forces. Duty, adventure, economic necessity, propaganda, peer pressure. And now they were dead because Ben had held down 2 triggers and hadn't let go. He tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the mission count. 20 missions complete, 5 to go, 5 more trips into German airspace, and he could go home. But the faces kept coming back. Not the German pilots' faces. He'd been too far away to see those clearly. But the faces of his own crew when they learned what he'd done. A mix of awe and fear. Awe that he'd been effective. Fear that he was the kind of person who could do that without hesitation. The nightmares started 3 days after the mission. He'd dream he was in the turret, firing, watching fighters fall. But in the dreams, when the fighters hit the ground, they'd crack open like eggs and civilians would spill out. Women, children, his mother, Sarah, people he knew. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, unable to distinguish dream from memory. The squadron medical officer noticed. Asked questions. Ben told him he was fine, just tired. The medical officer didn't believe him, but didn't press the issue. Too many aircrew were having nightmares. Not enough psychiatrists to treat them all. You dealt with it or you washed out. Those were the options. Mission 21 came 6 days after Schweinfurt. Another deep penetration raid, this time targeting aircraft factories near Munich. Ben climbed into the ball turret with fresh ammunition and hands that still trembled slightly when he touched the gun triggers. The fear was different now. Before, he'd been afraid of dying. Now he was afraid of what he might have to do to survive, afraid that he'd freeze up, unable to fire, because he couldn't stop thinking about the men inside those fighters, afraid that he'd fire too readily, too aggressively, become the kind of killer who didn't hesitate. The mission saw light fighter opposition, a few scattered attacks, but nothing requiring sustained defensive fire. Ben fired in careful bursts, tracked targets, followed doctrine. When they landed back at Ridgewell, he felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that he hadn't had to kill anyone. Disappointment that he hadn't been tested, hadn't proven to himself that he could still do what was necessary. Missions 22, 23, and 24 followed the same pattern. Routine raids, moderate opposition. Ben performed his duties competently, but without the aggressive intensity that had characterized the Schweinfurt mission. Other crews started referring to him as the gunner who broke the fighter attack, a reputation he didn't want but couldn't escape. New crews arriving at Ridgewell would ask to meet him, ask for advice. He'd tell them to follow doctrine, conserve ammunition, fire in bursts. When they'd ask about Schweinfurt, about the sustained fire technique, he'd tell them it was a specific tactical situation that probably wouldn't happen again. Most of them seemed disappointed. They wanted a secret technique, a guaranteed method of survival. He couldn't give them that. His 25th and final mission was scheduled for April 29th, 1944. A milk run, the crews called it, a relatively easy target with light expected opposition, the kind of mission you wanted for your last trip. Ben went through his pre-flight routine mechanically, checked his equipment, tested his guns, climbed into the turret at altitude and scanned the sky. The formation crossed into German airspace without incident, reached the target, dropped bombs, turned for home. No fighters appeared. Not a single enemy aircraft challenged them. The easiest mission of Ben's tour was his last. They landed at Ridgewell at 1600 hours. Ben climbed out of the ball turret knowing he'd never have to enter it again. 25 missions complete, tour finished. He was going home. The crew celebrated that night, drinking warm beer in the officers' club, toasting survival. Lieutenant Keller made a speech about how they'd beaten the odds, how they'd all made it through when statistics said at least some of them should be dead. Ben smiled and drank and tried to feel the relief he was supposed to feel. The journey home took 3 weeks. Train to London, transport ship across the Atlantic, processing at Fort Dix in New Jersey, and then a train to Pennsylvania, to the small town where Sarah waited and where his parents still lived in the same house he'd grown up in. Sarah met him at the train station. She looked exactly like her photographs. Pretty in a wholesome way, brown hair pinned up, wearing a dress she'd probably made herself. She hugged him, and he hugged back and felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no relief, just numbness. His parents threw a welcome home party. Neighbors came by. People asked about the war, about his experiences, about what it was like. He gave them sanitized versions, talked about the cold at high altitude, about the view from the ball turret, about the other men in his crew. He didn't mention Schweinfurt, didn't mention watching 12 fighters fall, didn't mention the nightmares that had followed him across the Atlantic. They wouldn't have understood. They'd never seen combat, never killed anyone, never had to reconcile what they'd done with who they thought they were. Sarah wanted to get married immediately. Ben suggested they wait. He needed time to adjust, to readjust to civilian life. She agreed, though he could see the disappointment in her eyes. They'd been planning this wedding since before he'd enlisted. She'd been waiting for him, faithful, writing letters, keeping his photograph on her nightstand. And now he was home, and he was asking her to wait longer. But she agreed because that's what you did. You supported the men who'd served. Ben got a job at the factory where his father had worked before the Depression. They were hiring veterans, good pay, steady work. He operated a lathe, cutting metal components for industrial machinery, repetitive work, safe work, the kind of job where the biggest danger was losing a finger if you weren't careful. He was good at it, precise, methodical. His supervisor praised his attention to detail. His co-workers liked him. He was quiet, reliable, showed up on time, a model employee. But at night, alone in the small apartment he'd rented, the dreams continued. Sometimes he was in the turret, firing. Sometimes he was in one of the falling fighters, watching the ground rush up. Sometimes he was both simultaneously killer and victim, unable to distinguish which perspective was his own. He'd wake up disoriented, unsure for a moment whether he was in Pennsylvania or over Germany. The transition from sleep to waking became something he dreaded. He started drinking, not heavily at first, just a beer or two before bed to help him sleep. Then 3 beers, then 4, then bourbon instead of beer because it worked faster. Sarah noticed, asked if something was wrong. He told her he was fine, just adjusting. She believed him because she wanted to believe him. They set a wedding date for September, 6 months away. Time enough for him to feel normal again. Time enough for the war to fade into memory. The news came in June. The Normandy invasion, Allied forces landing in France, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Ben read the newspaper accounts, saw the casualty figures, thought about the men still fighting while he operated a lathe in Pennsylvania. He felt guilty for being safe, guilty for surviving his tour when so many others hadn't, guilty for feeling guilty when he'd done his duty and earned his discharge. The guilt was circular, self-perpetuating, immune to logic or reason. In July, a reporter from the local newspaper came to interview him. Someone had told the paper about his war record, about the Distinguished Flying Cross, about Schweinfurt. The reporter wanted a human interest story. Local boy makes good. War hero returns home. Ben refused the interview. The reporter persisted. Ben refused again. The reporter published a story anyway, based on military records and interviews with people who knew him. The story described Ben as modest, heroic, reluctant to discuss his combat experiences. It got details wrong, exaggerated others, but it spread through town. People started recognizing him, thanking him for his service. He hated it. Sarah read the newspaper story, read about Schweinfurt for the first time, read about 12 enemy fighters shot down in 4 minutes. She asked him why he'd never mentioned it. He told her it wasn't important. She said, of course it was important. He'd saved lives. He was a hero. He said he wasn't a hero. He was a gunner who'd gotten lucky. She didn't understand the distinction. Couldn't understand why he didn't want to talk about the one thing everyone else wanted to hear about. The wedding happened in September as planned. Small ceremony, family and close friends. Sarah wore a white dress her mother had worn in 1920. Ben wore his uniform because Sarah had asked him to, and he couldn't think of a reason to refuse that wouldn't hurt her feelings. They exchanged vows in the same church where Sarah had been baptized. The reception was in the church basement. Cake and punch. A neighbor played piano. People danced. Ben smiled and shook hands and felt like an actor performing a role in someone else's life. The marriage was not happy. Sarah wanted children. Ben wasn't sure he should be a father. What would he teach them? How to kill efficiently. How to live with the memory of killing. Sarah wanted a house with a yard and a white picket fence. Ben wanted to stop having nightmares. Sarah wanted normal. Ben wasn't sure he could ever be normal again. They didn't fight. Fighting would have required a level of emotional engagement neither of them could sustain. They just existed in parallel. Two people living in the same house but occupying different worlds. In 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. The newsreels showed celebrations in cities across America. People dancing in streets, kissing strangers, laughing and crying simultaneously. Ben watched the newsreels and felt nothing. The war was over, but his war continued. The fighters still fell in his dreams. The faces still haunted him. Victory didn't change that. The Army Air Forces released a detailed study in 1946 examining defensive tactics used by bomber crews during the war. Schweinfurt was mentioned specifically. The study acknowledged that sustained defensive fire, when employed in tactical situations involving disorganized enemy formations, had proven effective in multiple engagements. It noted that while ammunition conservation remained important, rigid adherence to burst fire doctrine in all situations was counterproductive. The study recommended that gunner training incorporate scenario-based decision-making that allowed for tactical flexibility. In other words, what Ben had done was now officially recognized as valid. It had taken 2 years, a complete tactical analysis, and input from multiple commands, but the doctrine had changed. His 4 minutes of sustained fire had influenced how thousands of future aircrew would be trained. Ben never read the study, didn't know it existed. He'd stopped following anything related to the war, no longer read newspapers, avoided veterans gatherings. When the local VFW chapter invited him to join, he declined. When they asked him to speak at a Memorial Day ceremony, he declined. When they persisted, he stopped answering their letters. He wanted to forget, wanted to be left alone. The world wouldn't let him. In 1947, Sarah became pregnant. Ben tried to feel excited, tried to imagine being a father, teaching a child to ride a bicycle or throw a baseball. But when he closed his eyes and imagined the future, all he saw was the past, the turret, the fighters, the falling. Sarah gave birth to a daughter in early 1948. They named her Anne. She was healthy, beautiful. Sarah glowed with maternal joy. Ben held his daughter and felt terror. Terror that he'd fail her. Terror that she'd grow up and learn what kind of man her father really was. Terror that his nightmares would somehow infect her childhood. He tried to be a good father, worked overtime to provide for his family, came home every night, read bedtime stories, changed diapers, did all the things fathers were supposed to do. But there was a distance, a wall he couldn't cross. Anne would reach up to him and he'd smile back, but some essential connection was missing. Sarah noticed, tried to talk about it. Ben told her everything was fine. She knew he was lying, but didn't know how to challenge him. Their marriage became a polite fiction maintained for Anne's benefit. The Korean War started in 1950. America was at war again, new generation of young men being sent to fight. Ben watched the news and felt a complex mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that he was too old, too removed to be called back. Guilt that others were fighting while he was safe. The pattern repeated. Always guilt. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for killing. Guilt for not being able to feel what he was supposed to feel. In 1952, a letter arrived from the Air Force Historical Division. They were compiling combat histories of specific engagements. Schweinfurt was being studied in detail. They wanted Ben's personal account, what he remembered, what he thought, why he'd made the decision to use sustained fire. The letter was polite, official, emphasized that his participation was voluntary, but would be valuable for historical understanding. Ben threw the letter away. A second letter came. He threw it away. A third letter came with a phone number and a request that he call if he preferred to discuss the matter verbally rather than in writing. He didn't call. Sarah found the letters in the trash, asked him about them. He told her it was nothing. She said it clearly wasn't nothing if the Air Force was contacting him. He told her to drop it. She pressed. He raised his voice. Anne, now 4 years old, heard her parents arguing and started crying. Ben felt like a monster, shouted at his wife, made his daughter cry, all because he couldn't face talking about 4 minutes that had happened 8 years ago. He apologized. Sarah accepted the apology. But something broke that day, some last pretense that their marriage could recover. They separated in 1953, not divorced. Sarah's family was Catholic. Divorce wasn't acceptable, but they stopped living together. Sarah took Anne and moved in with her parents. Ben stayed in the house they'd bought, a small 2-bedroom place that felt enormous when empty. He saw Anne every weekend, took her to parks, bought her ice cream, tried to be the father she deserved. But the distance remained. She sensed it even at 5 years old. Sensed that something was wrong with her father, that he wasn't fully present even when he was physically there. Ben's drinking got worse. Not public, not falling down drunk. But every night, alone in that house, he'd work through a bottle of bourbon. Drink until the nightmares dulled. Drink until he could sleep. Drink until he couldn't remember why he needed to drink. His work performance declined. The factory supervisor, a veteran himself who'd served in the Pacific, noticed. Called Ben into his office. Asked if everything was okay at home. Ben said everything was fine. The supervisor looked at him with eyes that had seen Iwo Jima and said, "You're not fine, but I'm not going to fire you. Get help if you can. If you can't, try to keep it from affecting your work." Ben nodded, didn't get help, tried to keep his drinking separate from his job. In 1955, a film crew came to town. They were making a documentary about the strategic bombing campaign. They'd learned about Schweinfurt, about Ben's role. They wanted to interview him on camera. Ben refused. They offered money. He refused. They appealed to his patriotism, told him his story could help people understand what the war had been like. He refused. They went away disappointed. A local newspaper ran a small article about the documentary crew's visit, mentioned Ben's continued refusal to discuss his war experiences. The article portrayed him as humble. He wasn't humble. He was broken. Anne started school in 1954. She was bright, curious. Teachers loved her. She'd come home from school and tell her mother about what she'd learned, and Sarah would listen with pride. On weekends, she'd tell her father the same stories, and he'd nod and smile, but Sarah could tell he wasn't really listening. Anne started asking questions. Why didn't her parents live together anymore? Other kids' parents lived together. Why was her father different? Sarah told her that some families were different, and that was okay. Anne accepted this for a while. But children keep asking questions. Eventually, the answers stopped being sufficient. In 1957, Anne came home from school upset. Her class had been studying World War II. Her teacher had mentioned the strategic bombing campaign. Another student had said that bomber crews killed civilians, that they were no better than the Nazis. Anne had defended her father without fully understanding what she was defending. The other student had backed down, but Anne was left with questions. She asked Sarah what her father had done in the war. Sarah told her he'd been a gunner, that he'd protected other airmen, that he'd been very brave. Anne asked if he'd killed people. Sarah said yes, he'd killed enemy soldiers. Anne asked if killing was wrong. Sarah didn't know how to answer. The next weekend, Anne asked Ben directly, "Daddy, did you kill people in the war?" Ben looked at his daughter, this 8-year-old child with Sarah's eyes and his own dark hair, and knew he couldn't lie. "Yes," he said, "I did." Anne thought about this. Were they bad people? Ben wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her they were Nazis, enemies, that they deserved to die. But he couldn't. "They were people," he finally said. "They were soldiers, like I was. They were doing their job, like I was doing mine." Anne frowned. "But if they were just doing their job, why did you have to kill them?" Ben had no answer. How do you explain war to a child? How do you explain that sometimes survival requires killing people who aren't evil, who are just following orders, who have families and dreams, and futures that you're ending? He tried, told her that war was complicated, that sometimes countries fought and soldiers had to fight for their countries, that he'd done what he had to do to protect himself and the other men in his crew. Anne listened, seemed to accept this, then asked, "Do you wish you hadn't done it?" Ben was quiet for a long time, finally said, "I don't know." It was the most honest answer he'd ever given anyone. The conversation affected Anne. She started having nightmares. Sarah called Ben, angry, told him he shouldn't have been so honest with their daughter. Children needed to feel safe. They needed to believe their parents were good people who did good things. Ben agreed, apologized, promised to be more careful about what he said. But the damage was done. Anne had learned that her father was someone who killed people and regretted it. That knowledge changed how she saw him. In 1960, Ben turned 40, 23 when he climbed into that ball turret over the North Sea. 40 now, half his life ago, but it felt like yesterday. He still dreamed about it, less frequently than before. The alcohol helped, but the dreams never completely stopped. Sometimes weeks would pass without them. Then something would trigger a memory, a loud noise, a low-flying aircraft, the smell of machine oil. And that night he'd be back in the turret, watching fighters fall, counting the dead. He read an article in a magazine about post-traumatic stress. The term was new. The concept wasn't. Soldiers coming home changed, unable to readjust, haunted by combat experiences. The article suggested treatment, therapy, group counseling. Ben considered it, but seeking help meant admitting he had a problem, admitting he couldn't handle what he'd done. It felt like weakness. He'd survived 25 missions. He'd been decorated. He'd done his duty. Asking for help now, 16 years later, seemed pathetic, so he didn't ask. Sarah remarried in 1962, a widower from her church. Good man, stable, present in ways Ben had never been. Ben attended the wedding, shook the man's hand, told him to take care of Anne. The man promised he would. Ben believed him. Anne was 13 now, teenager. She had a stepfather who could be there for school events and parent-teacher conferences. Who could walk her down the aisle when she eventually married? Who wouldn't wake up screaming from nightmares about killing German pilots? Ben's isolation deepened. His contact with Anne became limited to occasional visits, birthdays, holidays, awkward meetings where they'd have lunch and struggle to find conversation topics. She was growing up, becoming her own person. Ben was proud of her but couldn't connect with her. The distance he'd felt when she was a baby had calcified into permanent separation. She loved him because he was her father, but she didn't know him, didn't understand him. How could she? He didn't understand himself. In 1964, Ben lost his job. The factory was downsizing, automation replacing workers. They let him go with 2 weeks severance. 20 years of service, gone. He found other work, lower pay, less stable. He moved to a smaller apartment, sold the house, sold most of his possessions, simplified his life down to essentials. Work, sleep, bourbon. The cycle repeated daily. He started attending a bar near his apartment. Same stool every night. Same drink. Bourbon. Neat. The bartender learned not to make conversation. Other regulars learned the same. Ben became a fixture, the quiet guy at the end of the bar who drank alone and never caused trouble. Sometimes other veterans would recognize something in him, would try to strike up conversation about their service. Ben would nod politely, give minimal responses. They'd eventually leave him alone. One night in 1966, a younger man sat down next to Ben, ordered a beer, started talking. He was headed to Vietnam, infantry, basic training complete, shipping out next week, nervous, excited, scared. Ben listened without responding. The young man asked if Ben had served. Ben said yes. The young man asked where. Ben said Europe, World War II. The young man's eyes lit up. The big one, he said. The good war. Ben took a drink of bourbon, said nothing. The young man asked what he'd done. Ben said he was a gunner. The young man asked if he'd seen combat. Ben said yes. How much? A lot. What was it like? Ben stared at his bourbon, finally said, "You'll find out." The young man seemed disappointed by the non-answer, drank his beer, left. Ben never saw him again. Sometimes wondered if the kid made it back from Vietnam. Probably did. Most did, but some didn't. Same as every war. Anne graduated high school in 1967. Ben attended the ceremony, sat in the back, watched her walk across the stage. She was beautiful, smart, had been accepted to nursing school. Sarah and her husband sat in the front row. They were the parents Anne talked about, the ones who'd raised her. Ben was the biological father who showed up occasionally. He knew this, accepted it. It was better this way. Anne deserved parents who weren't broken. She came to see him before leaving for nursing school. Wanted to talk. They met at a diner, ordered coffee. She told him about her plans, her dreams. She wanted to help people, make a difference. Ben nodded, told her he was proud. She asked him something she'd never asked before. "What did you do in the war? Really do?" Ben sighed, knew this conversation would come eventually. Told her, ball turret gunner, 25 missions, Distinguished Flying Cross, one mission where he'd shot down 12 enemy fighters in 4 minutes, changed defensive tactics for the rest of the war. Anne listened. When he finished, she asked, "Do you regret it?" Ben thought about lying, decided not to. "Every day," he said. Anne reached across the table, took his hand. "I'm sorry," she said. Ben shook his head. "Don't be. I did what I had to. That doesn't mean I have to be proud of it." They finished their coffee, hugged goodbye. Anne went to nursing school. Ben went back to his apartment and his bourbon. The 1970s passed in a blur. Ben worked, drank, grew older. The nightmares decreased in frequency, not because he'd healed, but because he'd learned to live with them. Acceptance rather than resolution. He retired in 1978, Social Security and a small pension, enough to live on if he lived simply. He moved to a cheaper apartment, spent his days reading, watching television, walking, avoiding people, avoiding questions, avoiding memories that wouldn't stay buried. Anne became a nurse, got married, had children. Ben became a grandfather. Sarah would call occasionally, update him on Anne's life, invite him to family gatherings. Sometimes he'd go. Mostly he'd decline. Being around Anne's family, seeing her with her husband and children, highlighted everything he'd failed to be. The grandfather who didn't know his grandchildren's favorite foods, who didn't attend their school plays, who sent birthday cards with money inside because he didn't know them well enough to choose actual gifts. In 1984, a historian contacted him, writing a book about the 381st Bombardment Group, wanted to interview survivors. Ben's name had come up repeatedly. Other veterans mentioned Schweinfurt, mentioned the ball turret gunner who'd held his triggers down for 4 minutes. The historian was persistent, called weekly, wrote letters, finally showed up at Ben's apartment. Ben let him in, made coffee. The historian asked questions. Ben answered. Factual responses only. Yes, he'd fired continuously. Yes, he'd expended all his ammunition. Yes, he'd engaged multiple targets, No, he didn't know exact kill counts. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. The historian took notes, asked about emotions. How did it feel? What was going through his mind? Ben said he didn't remember. The historian looked skeptical but didn't press. The interview ended. The historian thanked him, said the book would be published next year. Ben nodded. Never read it. Sarah died in 1989. Heart attack. Sudden. Anne called to tell him. Ben attended the funeral, sat in the back, watched his ex-wife being eulogized by people who'd actually known her. Her husband, her friends from church, their daughter. Ben had been married to her for 8 years, separated for 36. He'd known her for a total of maybe 5 years if you counted the time before they were married. Then he'd gone to war and come back someone else, and their marriage had been a slow dissolution. He mourned her, not for who she was, but for who she might have been if she'd married someone whole. The 1990s brought renewed interest in World War II, 50th anniversary commemorations. The surviving veterans were dying. Soon there would be none left. Documentaries, books, films. The greatest generation became a phrase. Ben watched some of the documentaries. They made war look noble, clean. The interviews were with veterans who'd processed their experiences, who could talk about combat with perspective and distance. Ben wondered if he'd ever reach that point, doubted it. In 1994, he received an invitation to a reunion of 381st Bombardment Group veterans. He'd ignored previous invitations. This one felt different. It was the 50th anniversary of Schweinfurt, the specific mission. They wanted him to attend, wanted him to speak. Ben threw the invitation away, then retrieved it from the trash, looked at the date. The location, a hotel in Nebraska. He could drive there, take a few days, see some of the country, maybe see some of the other men who'd survived. He called the number on the invitation, said he'd come but wouldn't speak. They said that was fine. Just attending would mean a lot. The reunion was strange. 24 men, all in their 70s now, gathered to remember when they'd been young and terrified and fighting for their lives. They shared stories, laughed about things that hadn't been funny at the time, showed photographs of wives and grandchildren. Ben listened, said little, recognized some faces. Others were strangers wearing name tags that claimed they'd flown together. Lieutenant Keller was there, the pilot from Liberty Bell. They shook hands. Keller introduced Ben to his wife, said, "This is the man I told you about, best gunner I ever flew with." Ben didn't know how to respond, said thank you. Keller's wife smiled, asked if he was married. Ben said divorced. She said that was too bad. Keller changed the subject. During dinner, someone proposed a toast to the men who didn't make it back. Everyone stood, raised glasses. Ben stood, held his glass of water. Thought about the German pilots who didn't make it back. Wondered if anyone toasted them. Probably. Different bars, different countries, same memories, same ghosts. After dinner, they showed a documentary about the 381st. Included footage of B-17s, combat film, fighters attacking, bombers falling, men dying, though the film didn't show that explicitly. The narrator talked about sacrifice, duty, the importance of the strategic bombing campaign. Ben watched, felt nothing. The documentary ended. Someone asked if anyone wanted to share memories. Lieutenant Keller stood, talked about Schweinfurt, talked about Ben, about how one gunner's decision had saved the formation, about how defensive tactics had changed because of it. Everyone looked at Ben, expected him to stand, to accept recognition. He stayed seated. Keller finished, sat down. The moment passed. That night in his hotel room, Ben had the dream again. First time in months. The turret, the fighters, the firing, the falling. He woke up disoriented. Took him a moment to remember where he was. A hotel in Nebraska. Reunion of men who'd survived. He was 73 years old. 50 years since Schweinfurt. Half a century. The dream didn't care. The dream was timeless. He left the reunion early, drove home, didn't attend the scheduled events, didn't say goodbye, just packed his bag and drove. Some of the other veterans called later, asked if he was okay. He said he was fine, just tired. They understood, or pretended to. Veterans knew not to push. Anne visited him in 1996, brought her daughter, Ben's granddaughter, 16 years old, pretty, smart, planning to apply to college. Anne thought it would be good for her daughter to know her grandfather, to hear his stories. Ben made coffee, tried to connect, asked about school, about her interests. She was polite, answered questions, asked some of her own. Did he really shoot down 12 planes? Where did she hear that? From her mother. It's true? Yes. What was it like? Ben looked at his granddaughter. This young woman who'd grown up in a world where war was something that happened on television. How could he explain? It was loud, he finally said, and I was scared. His granddaughter looked disappointed, expected something more dramatic, more heroic. Anne changed the subject. They finished their coffee, left. Ben wondered if he'd see them again. The new millennium came. Ben was 79. The nightmares were less frequent. His health was declining. Heart problems, arthritis, the normal complaints of aging. He moved into senior housing, a small apartment in a complex with other elderly people. Some were veterans. They'd recognize each other without speaking, nod, maintain distance, understand that some things weren't meant to be discussed. September 11, 2001 happened. Ben watched the towers fall on television, watched a new generation discover what war looked like when it came home. He thought about calling Anne. Didn't. She was in her 50s now, had her own life, own family. He was a peripheral figure, the father who'd never quite been a father. Better to leave her alone. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq started. Young men and women deploying, fighting, coming home changed. Ben recognized the pattern, wondered if they'd spend 50 years trying to reconcile what they'd done. Hoped not. Doubted they'd be any luckier than he'd been. In 2004, he had a heart attack. Mild. The doctors said he was lucky, needed to take better care of himself. He nodded, took the prescribed medications, stopped drinking, not out of health consciousness. He just didn't have the energy anymore. The bourbon had been self-medication. When the nightmares stopped being nightly events, the need for self-medication decreased. Anne came to visit him in the hospital, brought flowers, sat by his bed. They talked. Real conversation for maybe the first time in decades. She asked him about the war, not the combat, the rest of it. What it was like being 23 and terrified and trying to do your duty when your duty involved killing people. Ben talked, told her things he'd never told anyone. About the fear, about the guilt, about coming home and not knowing how to be normal, about how he'd failed her and her mother because he couldn't process what he'd done. Anne listened, cried, took his hand. I wish you'd told me sooner, she said. Ben shook his head. I couldn't. I can barely tell you now. They reconciled in a way. Not a dramatic healing, just an understanding. Anne forgave him for not being the father she'd needed. Ben forgave himself slightly for not being able to be that father. It wasn't complete. Forgiveness never is. But it was something. Ben lived another year, died in his sleep in March 2005. Heart failure, 83 years old. Anne arranged the funeral. Small service, few attendees. A military honor guard showed up, folded flag, 21-gun salute. The whole ceremony. Ben would have hated it, but he was dead and the living need rituals. They buried him in a veteran's cemetery. Simple headstone, name, rank, dates of service, decorations, distinguished flying cross mentioned. Nothing about Schweinfurt, nothing about 12 fighters in 4 minutes. Just a name on a stone among thousands of other names on stones. Anne found his war memorabilia when cleaning out his apartment. The medal, some photographs, his flight jacket, and a journal she'd never known existed. He'd kept notes, not regularly, just occasionally when the memories got too heavy. She read it, page after page of guilt and confusion, and attempts to understand what he'd done and why it still mattered decades later. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. I did what I had to do. I know that, but knowing doesn't help. I killed men who were trying to kill me. That's war. but they were still men, still someone's son or brother or father, and I still see them falling. After 60 years, I still see them falling. Anne cried reading that, cried for the father she'd never really known, cried for the young man who'd climbed into a ball turret and done something that would haunt him forever, cried for all the veterans who come home carrying weight invisible to everyone else. The story of Schweinfurt, of Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner's 4 minutes of sustained fire, is documented in military histories. It's a footnote in the larger narrative of the strategic bombing campaign. Defensive tactics were modified, training procedures updated. Future gunners learned that sometimes breaking the rules was necessary for survival. The tactical innovation was real. The impact was measurable. 12 fighters destroyed, 1 formation saved. Doctrine changed. But the human cost isn't in the tactical assessments. It's in a journal found in a dead man's apartment, in a daughter who finally understood her father only after he was gone, in 50 years of nightmares and guilt and inability to reconcile duty with conscience. Ben Warner did his job. He did it extraordinarily well. He saved lives. He changed how aerial combat was conducted, and he paid for it every single day for the rest of his life. The question the official histories don't ask is whether it was worth it. Not strategically. Strategically, it was absolutely worth it. 12 enemy fighters destroyed for the cost of some ammunition and overheated gun barrels. Excellent trade. But personally, for Ben, was it worth 50 years of psychological torment? Was it worth a failed marriage and a distant relationship with his daughter? Was it worth dying alone in senior housing, still seeing fighters fall? There's no good answer. War doesn't offer good answers. It offers necessary actions and long consequences. Ben did what was necessary. The consequences followed him home. The last people who remembered him personally are dying now. His daughter is elderly. His grandchildren barely knew him. Soon he'll be just a name in historical records, a footnote about defensive tactics. Maybe someone will make a documentary someday. Interview historians. Show archival footage. Explain how one gunner's decision changed warfare. They'll call him brave, call him innovative, call him a hero. They won't be wrong, but they won't be complete either, because heroism and trauma aren't mutually exclusive. You can do something extraordinary and be haunted by it. You can save lives and still question whether you should have. You can follow your training, break the rules when necessary, accomplish the mission, and still wake up 50 years later seeing the faces of men you killed. Ben Warner held down his triggers for 4 minutes, shot down 12 Bf 109s, changed how the Army Air Forces trained defensive gunners, received a medal, came home, and spent the rest of his life trying to understand whether survival was worth what it cost to survive. In the end, he's buried under a simple headstone in a veteran's cemetery, one marker among thousands. The dead don't judge. They just are. And somewhere in the soil of Germany, there are graves with German names on them. Pilots who died March 18, 1944 over the North Sea. Someone mourned them too. Someone wondered if their sacrifice mattered. Someone lived with the absence. War creates these parallel stories. Victor and vanquished. Hero and casualty. The man who fired and the men who fell. All of them human. All of them doing what they believed was necessary, all of them paying costs that extend far beyond the battlefield. This is what history doesn't always capture. The official record shows tactics, strategies, kill counts, victory, and defeat. It doesn't show the 79-year-old man waking up from a nightmare about something that happened when he was 23. Doesn't show the letters never sent, the conversations never had. The connections never made because war took a young man and gave back someone else. Benjamin Warner died in 2005. The war ended in 1945. But for him, for the space between those dates, the war never really ended. It just got quieter, became something he carried rather than something he fought. And when he finally died after 8 decades of life, 61 years after Schweinfurt, the last thing he wrote suggested he was still trying to make peace with 4 minutes that defined everything that followed. That's the real story, not just what happened in the sky over the North Sea, but what happened in the decades after. How one moment of extraordinary action creates a lifetime of extraordinary consequence. how duty and trauma intertwine, how you can do everything right and still be broken by it. The tactical innovation remains. Defensive fire doctrine was changed. Countless future aircrew benefited from lessons learned at Schweinfurt. In that sense, Ben's decision mattered. It saved lives beyond his own formation. It contributed to eventual victory. It was objectively the right tactical choice. But if you could ask him, if he could speak from beyond that simple headstone, would he say it was worth it? Would he trade those 4 minutes for 50 years of peace? The journal suggests he didn't know. Even after a lifetime of reflection, he couldn't answer that question definitively. Maybe that's the most honest conclusion. War doesn't offer clean resolutions. It offers complicated compromises. You do what you must. You live with what you've done. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find moments of understanding before the end. Ben found that with Anne in the hospital, a brief connection, a glimpse of forgiveness. But the fighter still fell in his dreams, right up until the end. That never changed. The tactical success, the strategic importance, the historical significance. None of it erased the fundamental human reality of 12 men falling from the sky because he held down 2 triggers and didn't let go. 4 minutes that saved a formation. 4 minutes that changed doctrine. 4 minutes that cost 60 years of peace. That's the equation. Both sides are true. Both sides matter. And the man who lived with that equation is buried now. His story mostly forgotten except in specialized histories in military archives. This is what we remember when we remember war. Not just the battles, not just the innovations, but the people who fought them, the costs they paid, the lives they lived in the aftermath. Benjamin Warner was a gunner who did his job extraordinarily well. He was also a man who couldn't escape what doing that job required. Both truths are important. Both deserve to be told. The sun sets over the veteran's cemetery where he's buried. The headstones cast long shadows. Somewhere in Germany, the sun sets over graves with different names, different stories, same shadows. The dead rest. The living carry them forward. And the question of whether it was worth it remains unanswered. Perhaps unanswerable. War is like that. Clear in the moment, complicated forever after.